Welcome to the Awe and Wonder podcast. We're talking with more leaders and change makers. And today we're excited to have Fran McCarthy join us. Fran, we know you from Washington State being an administrator. You were the director of special programs in the Northwest ESD, or Educational Service District, we call it. So it's the area of school districts in one particular part of our state. And I know you've been in other parts of the state, Spokane and all over. And we wanted to have you on this podcast because, for many reasons, we like to have that perspective of an administrator in special services. But we particularly thought of you because you're a boots on the ground, do what's right for kids, always thinking of kids first, and teachers kind of person. It seems like when we've had meetings with you, you always bring us back to how is this going to impact the kids and what can we do to make sure we're we're doing right by our students. And so you're just a huge advocate for students, and we're really glad to have you on today.
Yes, thank you.
Well, thank you. I'm very flattered that you asked me. And I'm just honored to be here.
Fran, tell us a little bit of your background and what you've done in your career. We know that you just retired. Congratulations.
Thank you. Um, I'm not sure I'm retired, but okay.
Okay.
So, a little bit of my background. I graduated college in the mid 70s, and I went to school in New Jersey. And had my certificate was early childhood, elementary ed, and then at that time they called it exceptional children.
Hmm.
And then my first teaching job was actually in Humble, Texas. I taught gen ed in an elementary school, and then took a kind of a break when I came up to Washington. And I became a classroom teacher in a middle school, and I seemed to get all the students who were on IEPs. And
Mm.
they asked me if I would do a self-contained program for behavior kids. And I'd never done that before. And I said, yes, if I can do project-based learning.
Mm.
And I think they were so happy that I would take these kids on that they would agree to anything. And my students were so successful that I was asked what I was doing. And I said, I'm just teaching them, you know. From there, I went on to become a TOSA / assistant principal in an elementary. I became an elementary principal and then special ed director. And that was kind of when I landed in that role, it sort of was where I stayed. And that was on Whidbey Island. Then my career took me to Spokane, where I was a special services director at ESD 101. I was recruited by Anacortes School District to become their executive director of student services. And since I always knew I was coming back to the West Side and to Whidbey, I took the position, and then was asked to apply for the ESD position here. And I felt like I could have more of an impact. Like in Spokane, I served 59 districts. And so when I went to the ESD here, I served 35. And I really enjoyed that work, going into the different districts. And that's where I retired from. I've been involved in a lot of um, initiatives in Washington State. I was on the one of the original SPDIG teams back in 2011, maybe.
So tell us what
Uh,
that is, Fran.
the SPDIG team was RTI implementation
Okay.
process run through OSPI, and I worked with four schools and Dean Fixon from University of North Carolina at that time.
So response to intervention.
Right,
Hmm.
right. And that went away, but the work didn't, right?
Hmm.
And then I became involved with inclusionary practices and UDL. I was a state trainer for the UDL before they actually pushed it out.
Hmm.
And was did that training at Harvard with two other ESD directors, and that
Neat.
was amazing uh, because we got to work with the original researchers on the brain,
Wow.
and it was just amazing. And now have been involved in MTSS and inclusionary practices in
Hmm.
in Washington, and like you said, just doing what's right for kids.
Yeah, it's interesting, Fran, because you're talking about things that you did either in the start of your career or throughout that we're still talking about today, right?
Right.
Project-based learning, that's what you were pushing for, and UDL, Universal Design for Learning, and Response to Intervention or MTSS, right? It's these things, it's like a pendulum. They come and go, but they're still always there. And how we talk about them maybe changes a little bit, or the definitions, but
You don't make it, decades in the profession without, some pretty core beliefs in children. You know what I'm saying? You don't
Right.
there you have to have something that you have to have internal motivation to stick with this, especially in the systems level that you were at. If not, it just feels like you aren't having the impact you'd hope for, you
Well, and you
know?
really don't know your impact. Um,
Mm-hmm.
actually, the students who were in my self-contained class in middle school, they're the ones who kind of find me on Facebook,
Mm-hmm.
which is really interesting. But I was living in on Whidbey and came back to live on Whidbey, and so these students I had in elementary school are now tall, are married, have children,
Right.
and they see me in our little community grocery store and actually are happy to see me. And it's
Yeah.
like, really? you
yeah,
know?
Yeah.
after all
And
these years.
so, when you're working with kids, you don't understand the
Yeah.
impact they have. You really
Yeah.
don't.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah. Well, is there a particular student in your career who inspired you or kind of helped keep you why focused?
Lots of kids. And
Yes.
and so I'll talk about, like I said, I went to school in New Jersey. I'm actually from New Jersey, born and raised there, and went to Brownies and Girl Scouts there. And there was when I was in Brownies, our leader started taking us to the North Jersey Training Center. So now this is in the 60s.
okay.
Mm-hmm.
Students were not included in school. Students with
Sure.
disabilities were put in these institutions.
Sure.
And so we would go because they'd have dances.
Mm,
And they had cottages where the children lived. And then there would be dance halls. And so
Mm-hmm.
my brownie troupe would go once a month and dance with these kids. And I
huh.
have a vivid memory. I had never seen a student or a child with a disability, being a child myself, even. I
Mm-hmm.
never had encountered um, even a child with Down syndrome,
Mm,
right?
Mm-hmm.
And and many of these children were nonverbal. Um, they had I mean, some of them had small heads, some of them,
Mm-hmm.
just a whole variety. But man, those kids could dance. And not just that, but they reached out. And I remember the first time I went, this young girl came across the room. She's probably my age. She could have been older. I don't know. She was completely
Mm-hmm.
nonverbal, grabbed my hand. So I'd go dance with her. And I just realized we're all, at that time I wasn't sophisticated enough, but
Sure.
I realized I wanted to be her friend.
mm,
Mm-hmm.
And then I wanted to bust her out of that place, and
mm.
so she
Mm-hmm.
could have a better life.
Yeah.
And that was really my first exposure. Later on, when I was in Coopville, the special education director, when I was principal, I found out she was from New Jersey too. We were only a year
Mm.
apart in age, but her grandmother was one of the cottage mothers
Oh my goodness.
Oh
at
my
this,
goodness.
at this institution. And she
Wow.
also went to dances with these.
Oh,
Yeah.
small world.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So when I say there's a whole ton, that was before I started my career.
Sure.
When I taught in Humble, Texas, they in the mid 70s, they were just starting to include students with severe disabilities in school.
Hmm.
And I will say this teacher's name, she's since passed on, but her name was Amy Young. And Amy taught this class. Well, and I was teaching elementary school, and we were like, well, why can't your kids be with mine? And
Hmm.
we used to laugh. Like when we'd meet up years later, we were doing inclusion before
Hmm.
it was even a word. I
Wow.
mean, the
Right.
children, my little third graders would hold their hands and we'd have art together and do science together. I mean, and so I guess, I mean, just the fact that there are so many children out there who overcome difficulties
Hmm.
just to survive
Hmm.
Right.
made me want to make it a little easier for them.
Hmm.
Right.
And, and I had students who are impacted in my classroom throughout my career. And I never thought to say, well, that's your kid, not mine.
Mm.
Hmm.
Yeah.
And I never thought not to include them as
Hmm.
all of them were
All
my
kids means all
charge.
kids. Yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
So over the years, there have been many
Hmm.
students who have touched me and have I've grown and learned from them.
Hmm.
Even the
Hmm.
most difficult students. I mean, sometimes I look back on my first year teaching and feel like I should send apology letters to all the
Yeah,
kids.
we all do.
You
Yeah.
I
know,
mean,
it's like I
yeah.
had no idea what I was doing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I really hope they felt respected.
Well, I mean,
Yes.
apparently they do. They're seeking you out now, right?
Yeah,
And that just shows that, like you said, it's respect and you've made a human connection with them. Just like that girl at the brownie dance made a connection with you, and that's interesting how you were influenced by her, right?
oh, absolutely. But well, by the all of the kids there.
Mm-hmm.
Hmm. Hmm.
Sweet. What a neat
Yeah,
story.
yeah,
But it just goes to show that without inclusion, right, without just awareness, oh, there are kids different than me. You mean you have to start there, right? You have to
right.
start with there before to have to let those relationships impact you, right?
Mhm.
So that's where inclusion comes full circle, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
I love that. So as we think about, you talked about some of those principles that you started your career with and we're still talking about now, like universal design for learning and inclusion. What are some principles like that maybe are important to you or that you've noticed that have endured?
Yeah, I mean, I have, um, I believe that all children can learn, right? So that really has been my focus, no matter what grade or level I've been teaching. I really believe all children can learn, right? And that we have to find that key that activates that part of the brain
Hmm.
uh, that will enable them to learn. Um, brain science is amazing and it's come so far, but we just have to learn what to do with the information we have. Um, I think education is a civil right, as equity
Hmm.
in education is a civil right that
Hmm.
all
Hmm.
everybody should be welcome. And I also know I don't have all the answers, and I never will, right?
Hmm.
And um, and respect. Like, even so, I had a little guy in a behavior school, and I was the regional administrator, and I go and he's acting out like he's just got an audience of two adults, and he is like going for it, and I said, hey, because he knew me. I said, what's going on? He said, well, I'm just demanding my respect. I want to be respected. And I looked at him and I said, I always respect you. And he just was like, he had no response. He was like,
Right.
oh yeah, you do. you know and and because I had that connection with him, we were able to get him to disengage from that
Hmm.
behavior.
Yeah.
And maybe he didn't have 100% day, but he no longer was performing for his audience of two adults who
Hmm.
didn't know what to do with him.
Hmm.
um, so I really think respect, and that, if you're doing an intervention and it doesn't work, you try something else. Don't just throw up
Right.
your hands and say, oh,
Hmm.
well, this child needs an IEP. Well, maybe not. Have I
Hmm.
tried everything? Have I talked to my peers to get ideas from them? Maybe it's just a little switch that needs to be flipped. So, I mean, those are, and also learning should be fun. And
Mm.
students should have a voice in their learning, and they have a
Hmm.
right to question authority. I mean, they absolutely do. I said that in one of my master's classes when I was getting my master's, and the people were appalled. They were like, "No, no, they don't have a right."
Mm.
And I'm like, if I do, they do.
Yeah.
And
Hmm.
they need to be part of that dialogue.
Well,
Hmm.
yeah.
Learning
And
is very personal.
it's personal,
Yeah.
and that's what helps, especially with our students with disabilities, that's what helps connect it and make it something that's worth doing, right? When things are hard, extra hard for you, making it personal and something that you're part of is so important.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, they have to have ownership, and that's part of UDL, which is why it resonated so well with me. Is that students take ownership of their learning
Mm-hmm.
and how they
Hmm.
learn,
Mm-hmm.
and, and learning how to advocate for themselves.
Did you ever have a child in your classroom, Fran, as a teacher that was nonverbal or non-speaking or that used AAC in any way?
Um, I have had several deaf students
Mm.
who had interpreters. And,
Hmm.
when I started teaching in the dark ages, we did not have computers or iPads
Mm-hmm.
but later we had communication devices.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, I remember a little guy in middle school. He had one of the first communication devices. And man, he was like so proud of himself. We
Mm-hmm.
could
Hmm.
program in specific words so
Sure.
that he could make his needs known, and it
Hmm.
changed his life.
Mm-hmm.
Hmm.
I mean, it just because he could communicate, and up until then, nobody had even tried to teach him to sign or any of that. He just was
Hmm.
nonverbal and acting out
Mm-hmm.
Hmm.
because he wasn't getting his needs met.
I'm curious about your interactions with families over the years. It seems to me like you're the kind of person who has a good relationship with families, but how's that impacted um your role or what you've done with students?
I think that's the hardest frontier to conquer, um, especially in the world of special education. Um, People have heard so many bad things about their children.
Mm,
Um,
Hmm.
and it is hard now, I think, more so to get families into the school. And it's a variety of reasons. People are just struggling. I mean, and
Hmm.
working hard,
mm-hmm,
put food on the table and to manage their families and their lives. But um, again, the same thing. I mean, I've had parents in my face yelling at me, and I've learned to just listen to what they're saying and find the kernels of truth, and then you
Mhm.
can start building on that. But I've had families that there's just no way you're going to have a good relationship with them too.
Mm.
So that I think is really hard for everybody,
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
and the way our system is set up, we don't go to the families. We insist the families come to us,
Right.
Right,
and we insist they come to us at specific times.
right.
And that's really alienating, you
The
Right.
know?
service delivery model alone is pretty is not conducive to having parents be really a part of their child's education,
Right.
even though it's, oftentimes it's people are meeting people in their child's team for the first time at the IEP meeting, and that might be May. I mean, that might be towards the end of a school year,
Yeah.
and like, how do we bridge that gap and um, have families be more part of the team that is the child's education system?
And that's the age old question. I mean, it
Hmm.
really is. And it's very hard presenting in a positive way and a respectful way is
Hmm.
always helpful, but it doesn't always go the distance. Now, I do, again, I say that, but then I do run into parents. I mean, and they thank me, but that's years
Mm.
later. You don't know
Right.
Yeah,
while you're in it, and you just have to have your own moral compass.
yeah,
Be true to that.
right.
Like you're saying, it depends on where that parent is at in that moment, right?
Right.
They may
Hmm.
hear something you've said, or you may hear something they've said much, much later that
Yeah.
resonates.
Yeah. I mean, I'll
Hmm.
have parents. I actually had one parent, a grandparent, raising her grandchildren, right? And um, I ran into her years later, and she thanked me, and I was like, "Yeah, what for?" And she says, "Well, I remember we were at a meeting, and you said this about my grandson," and I was like, "Okay." I don't
Hmm.
remember it, but I'm glad it made it easier.
Oh,
Hmm.
I love that. It,
Yeah.
Yeah,
it's interesting
yeah.
because you're talking about how often in IEP meetings it's a lot of negative, right? They're not doing
Mhm.
it yet, they're not doing that. We talk about strengths-based learning, and I was just in a session at ASHA, and they were talking about strengths-based, not as like, oh, they're so wonderful and they have a great smile, It's like there's science that they're what are the actual skills that they are
Right.
Hmm.
doing to help you move forward. Mhm.
No, I agree. And I think that students should be invited to their IEPs. I've
Hmm.
had students in kindergarten come to
Hmm.
IEP meetings, but then there's
Hmm.
parents who don't want them there, right? But
Hmm.
I really feel like they need to hear, but they need to hear the good things about themselves.
Hmm.
True. That's true.
How have you advised teams to who don't agree on placement or don't agree on the skills, honestly, or that seem disjointed? How have you advised teams in a way that brings together the common goal?
One of the things is we all have to listen to each other and not get
Hmm.
confrontive. Uh,
Hmm.
one technique I used when I was running meetings, I would do like a chart and have, the parents would tell us about your child, and they'd tell us all about their kid. Okay, next line. Okay, team, tell us your view of this child. What's their strengths? And then I never called it deficits. I would call it concerns, and then have
Hmm.
everybody chime in. And then we would list possible solutions. And everybody got to contribute.
Mm-hmm.
Hmm.
And then we would look at what was made the most sense. And also
Hmm.
understanding that if, again, we're trying something and it doesn't work, we come back to the table and we don't wait
Hmm.
a year, right?
Mm-hmm.
Right.
we can come back and talk about this so that it doesn't sound like we're locked into something.
I bet,
Hmm.
yeah, I bet that made a big difference for families in particular because you think kind of like this is my one shot to meet with these people and try something, right? You want to know that it can change and be fluid.
Hmm. I mean, and we have families who agree to an evaluation, but then won't agree to interventions.
Hmm.
Mm,
It's so you just making sure everybody's heard and it's
right.
not arguing. And you can
Hmm.
have that pre-meeting before you meet with parents and kind of lay out the structure and you the system that you want to put in place for the meeting. And
Hmm.
check egos at the door.
Yeah, it's less you're coming with a completed IEP and recommendations. It's more everybody's coming to the table with perspectives and problem
Right.
solving. I like that.
And you could still have a draft IEP,
Hmm.
but it's a draft
Hmm.
and it
Hmm.
can be changed. And I mean, throughout the years, I've been in meetings where the IEP is just what is going to be, whether it's a draft or not. And I
Right.
think we have to look at it differently.
I think in particular with AAC, the speech therapist, has a level of buy-in, the teacher has a level of buy-in, the family has a level of buy-in, and oftentimes those are not they're not in alignment just
Right.
because of life experiences, right? And so it's like, how do we help them, everybody get on the same page? And that doesn't necessarily mean agree with a particular person. It just means, so I like your approach on saying, so what are the strengths? What are the concerns? Because I think when the concerns get voiced and heard, then the solutions become a little bit more realistic
Hmm.
versus it's like, oh, the device should be out all the time and everyone should be modeling all the time. The end.
Yeah,
There's no other way to do that, and it's like, well, wait a minute. What are your concerns? Like, what's the reality of that, right? What are your concerns with that model? What are your concerns with that model? It doesn't matter if there's data to prove that that's best practices if it's not best practices for the people who are actually trying to do the work, right?
exactly.
So it's like, wait a minute, there's best practices, and then there's all the humans involved in the practice.
Yes. Well,
That's best
but we
practice,
have to come back to the heart of the child,
right?
the heart of the student, and not what the adults want.
Right.
Hmm.
And that's tricky, right?
It is very tricky. It is very tricky, and it's like, can we allow a student to listen to the novel that they're reading in class because they have reading is really difficult for them and
Mm-hmm.
let them have that literacy analysis that we want them to have
Mm-hmm.
rather than continuing to read on a primer level
Mm-hmm.
and not getting engaged in their actual curriculum.
Right.
Can we allow a child to verbally respond to test questions or have
Mm-hmm.
the test questions read to them?
Right.
Um, I remember a story of this is someone I worked with, and she taught self-contained behavior kids, and they would go out and they were middle school, and so they went out to social studies, and there was the social studies teacher did not want these kids in his classroom. And so it was test day, and the social studies teacher came in waving the test paper. It was like, see, this child, this student got an F that doesn't belong in my classroom. And when she looked at the questions, they were answered correctly, but they were one or two words. And
Mm-hmm.
this teacher's whole thing was, well, it's not in complete sentences. So are we testing on complete
Yeah.
sentences
Hmm.
or are we testing on knowledge?
And I
Yes.
do think we need to look at, what are we measuring?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think this
Yeah.
comes up
What
a
are we
lot. I was just reflecting on a tool. The Ties Center has a lot of resources on inclusion and things like that. And they have
Yeah.
the, you probably know this 5, 15, 45 tool. And it's like, if
Mm-hmm.
we only have 5 minutes to figure out co-teaching or something that's important for this kid, this student who's in your class who has a disability, what are we going to talk about as, and it's like, what are the essential concepts that he or she needs to get from this lesson?
Mhm.
And that's kind of what you're reminding me of. Like, and I think Brenda and I are talking about this a lot in our consults for students who use AAC. Like, what is
Mhm.
the goal here?
Mhm.
Let's remember what we're doing. We're not testing them on XYZ. You want them to communicate or whatever your goal is.
Yeah, a friend of mine, actually, he's a professor, University of Florida, and then teaches at their lab school. His name's John Mundorf, and he was actually teaching some components of the UDL class that I took years ago. And he had a little girl in his fourth grade class who was blind. She was visually impaired. But she sat at her desk with her Braille machine, reading her Braille book, answering, and did not have a one on one with her because of the devices she was able to use. She assimilated perfectly into that classroom. You
Mhm.
know, there's so much we can do for our children with technology.
Yes, that is true. That is true.
What do you think are some of those systematic hangups, those roadblocks that we need to identify and avoid so we can stay creative around these things?
I've seen over my 40 years of teaching, I have seen the culture ebb and flow.
Mm-hmm.
And it's it got to a point at one point where if a child fell behind, they were automatically referred to special ed
Mm-hmm.
so that the gen ed teacher didn't have to worry about them.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I see that changing, and that warms my heart, right?
Mm-hmm.
And but just that the children in our classroom, the children in my classroom belong to me. That's not to say they don't need special supports, but they're
Mm-hmm.
my responsibility,
Mm-hmm.
no matter how they present to me. And
Mm-hmm.
it's my job that this is our child. It's
Mm-hmm.
not your responsibility, it's ours.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and that we have to look at how to make it work
Mm-hmm.
for the kids. Um, and, they come to us in various shapes, sizes, mental states, trauma based, but
Yeah,
they all belong to us
right.
as soon as they enter the door. And is it overwhelming? Sometimes, absolutely. It's
Mhm.
overwhelming. And the systemic piece too is we're a team, right? We can't teach in isolation.
Mm-hmm.
We have to rely on each other and lift each other up and support each other as well as supporting our students.
Mm-hmm.
And there are so many, we lose sight of the fact that there's so many people out there who are passionate and kind and good. Um, and we have to be careful not to get sucked into the negative.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, my advice would, because sometimes teachers' lounges are pretty toxic, and my
Mhm.
advice would be find people who aren't and invite them to eat in your room with you.
Mm.
Mm-hmm.
I have a friend who did that. She was a middle school teacher, and the way she got people in her room, she bought an espresso machine, invited them in for lunch, and made them all coffees.
That'll
You
do it.
know, but just to be more positive.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I like that.
People are stressed. People are tired. Um, and I don't think the adults have really come out of COVID.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and we have to be gentle with each other,
Mhm.
but it's really just embracing our profession,
Mm-hmm.
and embracing our children and not pushing them off on someone else.
When we do consults, we'll be talking to people, and if it starts to get negative, I know one of the things we say is, no, everyone went into this to help children.
Right.
Remember that. Everyone is thinking that they are wanting to help children. They're thinking what they're doing is helping children.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the least dangerous assumption that everyone in the room is actually there to help, right?
Right.
And if you start with that, everyone here is invested in your child. It looks different, it feels different. We don't all agree, but if we operate from a space that everyone is in this room because they care about this student, then we can kind of give each other grace around from where they're coming from, right? So
Right.
so if I assume that you are here because you care about this child, then you said that because you thought it would help this conversation. You said that because you felt like that information needed to be on the table as we
Mm-hmm.
problem solve. And there's such a healthy mindset of assuming everyone that's here is here because they want to help. Now, everyone's been in a meeting with somebody who's totally burned out.
Yeah.
and
And we all
and
have bad days.
we all have bad days. Parents, teachers, paras, the kid, right? Like
Right.
the fact that we're all having a good day on the same day is pretty unlikely. But I think just that mindset alone, right, is like, what if I go into this? And sometimes, we consult on due process or litigation or
Mm-hmm.
other things. And it's like, what if we go into this meeting saying, okay, but what does the kid need? Because I'm pretty sure we're all here because we want to help this kid. So
Mm-hmm.
let's start from that space. That seems like a safe space to start into. And, you were talking about brain too earlier, and it's like, if you come in with everybody, this is going to be a horrible meeting, your
Right.
brain will look for all the things horrible, right? If you come in with everyone is here because they care about this kid, your brain will look for, and they care about that part about my kid. They care about this part about my kid, or this part about education, or this part about inclusion, or this part about my child's emotional state. So it's like the mindset helps you move forward in a positive way, and it helps you recognize that everyone is learning. Everyone is still learning about your child. Everyone's still problem solving. Everyone's spitballing here, like you said in your process. And so, what are the ways we could solve this problem? And we're going to land on one, and we're going to try it for whatever timeline we think is good. And if it doesn't work, we're going to do something else. And that
Right.
doesn't mean next IEP, right?
Right.
Let's treat this person with respect as a human and not beat our head against the wall for a whole year. What's a normal timeline here to reconvene about this, and just one step at a time, respecting each one's the thought that each one's here because they care about children.
And what kind of data do we need to collect
Hmm.
to know if we're succeeding? And that's
Hmm.
a mark that over the years has been hit and miss. Sometimes students get referred to special ed in the hallway because the teacher comes up to the resource room teacher and says, you need to take this kid, right? And for no other reason. And then they
Hmm.
qualify under the discrepancy model, but maybe no interventions were ever tried in this child's life. Or maybe the child has a hearing impairment and we're not doing the appropriate, like we don't have mics in the classroom, the teacher
Accommodations.
isn't
Yeah.
mic'd, we don't have preferential seating, but oh, I need this child out of my room because they're a distraction, you
Hmm.
know. And then, we need data to make informed decisions.
Hmm.
We need consults to know what's out there because I know even your classroom teachers now have no idea what kind of technology can really help a
Hmm.
child access their education. And
Right.
technology changes so fast.
So true.
Yes.
It's something different every day. It's beyond
Yeah.
just making switches for kids. It's
Mm-hmm.
Right.
there's so many other things,
Mm-hmm.
you
Yes.
know.
And I know sometimes teachers feel like I don't even know what I don't know to ask for, right?
I feel that way. So,
Yeah, me
I mean,
too.
I
Yep.
know
Yeah,
people
I
who
mean,
know, right? And I
Right,
would
right,
call them and say, "Help me out here."
right,
yes.
right.
But what you're really talking about is how do we keep moving the field forward?
Right.
How are we keeping people growing? And the first thing is to be okay with I don't know.
Yeah.
And the next thing and I think funding is always a question. So especially in rural areas and smaller districts, they don't have as many resources and they also don't seem to have the funding for um, the consults, or at least the teachers or the special ed people don't think the district has the resources, right? So, what would you say to a professional right now that's like, listen, like for AAC, for example, we this is my first kid in the whole district with AAC. I literally was consulting with a very small district in Washington, and they had no one in a wheelchair in the whole school district.
Hmm.
So now someone's coming in and it's like, do we have the resources to what do we need to do? So what is the advice right now when it's like, okay, you're overwhelmed and you don't think your district has the right resources?
So, my advice is to talk to those in charge in the district, but then also remember you have your educational service districts,
Mm-hmm.
and your educational service districts have connections, and
Mm.
they can help you solve problems,
Mm. So you feel
and
like you're not
people
getting
don't
anywhere
reach
with your
out
counselor.
enough
Yeah.
to the educational service districts.
Right, because there's different areas, right? There's someone who can help with behavior and
Right.
someone who can do other things. Fran, do you know if every state has something like that? In
They're called different things. I mean, but they have some regionalization and support. Sometimes it comes right from the state level,
mm-hmm,
but
Mm-hmm.
they do have some things.
mm-hmm,
Every state does. They just call it like Oregon calls it different than California than what we have.
mm-hmm.
Um, I don't I don't know about Idaho. When I lived in Spokane, I would get a lot of people from Idaho wanting our help,
Mm,
right?
mhm,
Um, but every state to some degree has a special ed department.
mhm.
Mm-hmm.
So, Fran, I mentioned that you're retired, and you said, "Well, I don't know if I'm retired." So, what are you up to right now?
I I started consulting. I am working with the Ames project for coaching a district for MTSS implementation, and
Oh,
that's
And what
really
is the Ames
exciting.
project?
It is through the University of Washington Bothell, and they
Okay.
focus on MTSS. Bill Rasplica leads it,
hmm
so he's got a small grant through OSPI. I'm also going to be working with, I don't know if it's through Ames, but it's a grant through either Ames or Eastern Washington University to go into districts and do help them go through that MTSS implementation rubric to
Oh,
see to take stock and see
hmm
where they are. Um, I really have a passion for inclusion, and I really have a passion for students and their abilities. And so I'm just looking for little projects to work with. The Inclusionary Practices Summit has been really exciting. I've been involved in that on their board, on their executive board for 2 years. It started as just, hey, why don't we do this? And it has just grown and grown, which really shows the need. Last year we had 500 people attend, and a lot of them were teachers.
that's
So
nice.
there's a thirst out there, and that
Mm-hmm.
excites me.
hmm
So I'm looking for things to keep me occupied, to keep my passion growing. Um, something people don't know about me probably is I'm on the North Puget Sound Dragon Boat team.
Oh,
So I paddle with a dragon boat club out of Oak Harbor. So if any of
Oh,
your
cool.
listeners want to come and try us out, not too far from Oak Harbor, they're more than welcome.
oh, neat. So that's open
Yeah.
to people.
Oh, everybody.
Oh,
Yeah.
neat. Yeah, and you mentioned living on Whidbey Island, and we do have listeners from other states and other countries, and I just have to put a plug out there for how beautiful it is where you live. What a
Mm,
nice,
Beautiful and windy, but
yeah.
yeah.
yes. Yes.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Fran. This has been really fun to talk to you. I learned a lot about your history as a teacher I didn't know, and your your passion for students and for inclusion definitely shines through your career. You're starting as a teacher to all the initiatives and things you've been involved in
Yeah.
for years.
Well, thank you, and it's really been a pleasure. Thank you for keeping this alive and looking for ways for our kids to succeed. Thank you so much.
Well, when we do these Leaders and Changemakers series, it's like these people, as in you, they're retiring and they're leaving without imparting all their wisdom. So we want to have these conversations because those of us who still have 10, maybe 20 years left in working, it's like we don't want to repeat mistakes, right? And you don't want us to either, right? We want everyone to enter. When we have students, I'm like, I want my student to enter where I'm at. So that they're moving on. They push the field forward, and instead of relearning old lessons, So
Well, and it's all about networking, and I
yeah.
have a network across the nation.
Mm-hmm.
There are people I can call anywhere that I have accrued during my career.
Yes.
And ask for advice.
Yeah.
And, we don't have all the answers. We're never going to have all the answers. And every day, even when I'm retired, every day there's something I learn.
Yes.
So,
and being open to that. So,
yep.
Thank you for always being a teacher.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you.
The contents of this podcast were developed under contract with the Washington Office of the Superintendent of Public Instruction, U.S. Department of Education, and administered by Central Washington University. However, those contents did not necessarily represent the policy of the OSPI and CWU, and you should not assume endorsement by the federal and state government.